welcome to the HEAL webinar for reintroduction of wolves in Colorado. As you know, as many of you may know, voters in Colorado approved a ballot initiative called Proposition 114, which will introduce gray wolves in Colorado. In Colorado, wolves were hunted to extinction by 1930s, 1940s. This is the first time a US state has voted to introduce a wild animal in the ecosystem. We found this to be very interesting as many of us here in India are working with human-animal conflict, and this may have lessons for us, particularly for us who are working with people and trying to get people to coexist with leopards or coexist with elephants. We have with us Rick Ritter, who is going to speak about the wolf reintroduction. Rick has been a key campaigner and a key activist for reintroduction in wolves to Colorado. So over to you, Rick.
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate your invitation. A couple of things of import, just to give some background. In addition to Colorado passing a wolf reintroduction, the nation of Switzerland, within the last 6 weeks, passed a referendum on wolf, shall we say, habitat expansion in that country. So that in two different parts of the world, there has been sort of active voter engagement on wolf reintroduction issues. Second thing, you mentioned it prior to the outset, that your organization is involved with sort of human interaction with leopards and elephants. Our daughter was very active with Save the Elephants in Kenya, where she in fact used the GPS systems to track human interactions with elephants. So we have a little bit of background on that one from her efforts. She, I suppose you could say that she used that expertise to herd the battleground states for President-elect Biden's campaign. So I think there may be some interaction between elephants and voters. So let me talk a little bit about wolf.
Just before you start, Rick, one quick thing.
Yes.
If anyone has any questions, you can put those on the chat box, and we can curate those and pick them up and post them to Rick at the end of the conversation. Over to you, Rick.
Super, and that's great. What I'll talk for a few minutes, and then we'll go forward with questions and answers. A couple of things. As indicated, wolves were in Colorado up until the 1940s, and they were exterminated by ranchers, hunters, and in fact, there was bounties on them. There was a major effort starting in the 1860s, 100, 200 years ago, to drive them out of Colorado. This was done largely by the ranching community in order to take over the lands where both Native Americans were, but also where various other species were that they considered to be threatening to their lifestyle. Wolves were reintroduced to the Western states in 1995 in Yellowstone, and the impact of the wolves in Yellowstone have become somewhat mythical in the American populace. There's been numerous videos, documentaries on the impact of wolves on the Yellowstone ecosystem. And this has spawned a dramatic sense among voters that wolves should be reintroduced in other parts of the country. to which that has occurred in the states of Idaho, Montana, Oregon, Washington, and now we're even seeing perhaps some wolves in Northern California. But all through that period, there has been a significant amount of tension between the wolf community, sort of the wolf activists and wolves themselves, and the ranching community. When we decided to move forward with our ballot initiative, and that came about after a number of years where there have been efforts to reintroduce wolves through the Colorado Parks and Wildlife, which is a administrative office that runs fundamentally sort of wildlife operations, hunting, fishing, as well as our park system. And it is the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission, which is the managing organization, is made up and composed by law of largely ranchers and those involved in agriculture. What that means is they were totally opposed to wolf reintroduction. Hence, we had to go to the voters to, shall we say, overrule the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission and Department ultimately. So what we did is we crafted a ballot initiative. Now in Colorado, we have a remarkable law which allows, if you collect a certain number of valid signatures, valid being those people who are registered to vote in Colorado, that you can place a ballot initiative on the ballot. In other words, so that voters get to vote on this.
Direct democracy.
It's a form of, as my partner just said, direct democracy. We knew that when we were putting it forth that we would have significant challenges from the opposition, which we did. And the opposition to the ballot initiative, even as we were crafting the ballot initiative, they were organizing against us, were hunters, particularly big game elk hunters, who feared that wolves would reduce the number of elk in the state. Two were ranchers, particularly cattlemen, but also sheep, what we call wool growers, but it's basically sheep herders, because they were fearful of deprivation of their livestock. To accommodate those concerns, at least in terms of the wool growers and the ranchers, we wrote into our initiative the ability for them to receive compensation should there be deprivation of their livestock. So right now, once wolves are reintroduced, if they're able to prove that a wolf killed a sheep or a calf, that in fact, at that point, they would get compensation for that animal from the state. And these were the type of things that we tried to include in our ballot language. And we did a tremendous amount of research, a lot of polling on voter attitudes. And one of the three key things that we found were we had to designate where the wolves would be reintroduced, which was for our language, it said west of the Continental Divide, which is the very rural areas of Colorado. Two, that there would be a limited number that would be reintroduced. You couldn't just go out there and say, we're going to put 500 wolves on the ground. That scared people. So what we simply began to say, a limited number over the course of a few years in order to allow a viable population. And that was a critical piece of the language. And thirdly, there was the compensation. And I'd even add that the other key piece of it was the sense that we had to give a deadline and that the state has to do this by December 2023. It gave voters a sense that if we told them to do this, then they would do this and they wouldn't delay. That was very important to particularly women in our research who saw government as often making promises, but then not delivering. We then collected the signatures. We made it on the ballot officially in January. And then, interestingly enough, we raised about $1.5 million, $2 million to get on the ballot. But our poll, quite frankly, was initially so positive, some of our big backers said, no, now that you're on the ballot, it doesn't make any difference. Well, you don't need the money. And in addition, we faced competition for funding from the presidential campaign as well as numerous other political campaigns. So in a very strange sense, our fundraising began to diminish once we were on the ballot. That didn't mean that our opposition didn't raise money and spend a significant amount of money against us. One of the things that our research showed, which goes to the notion of sort of messaging, was the importance of stressing restoring the balance. And that voters definitely believe that there is an imbalance in nature, whether it be a result of climate change, whether it be a result of population density increasing in the state, whether it be a sense that the wildness of Colorado is disappearing. That voters were very, very strong in their desire to what we call restore the balance and create some kind of dynamic that allowed wolves to roam in Colorado, and it gave them a sense of satisfaction. When we did various focus groups, we would ask questions such as, well, what would wolves mean to you? And part of it was a sort of sense of restoration of the West, of the sense of the American West. And I know all of you have seen movies of American cowboys and Indians. Well, there is a very much a great sense in the state of Colorado that we are part of that heritage and that we need to continue to continue that heritage and that ideal lifestyle. And it's just
a relationship.
Yeah, and the relationship between humans and nature and wildlife.
Yeah.
So you need to be able to say, look, there's an interaction here, that we're all codependent. And there was very much a sense that these voters thinking this is something that we should do, not just for ourselves, but from a generational standpoint. We want to try, we know that we can't restore it completely, but we can make a step to bring it back to a way that it once was that would benefit us and our kids. So our structure of our message, and message is really about what do you want, and strategy, which is political strategy, is about two things. That's all. What do you want to say, and who do you want to say it to? And for us, what we wanted to say is that wolves would restore the balance in nature, that it was important for future generations to have wolves, that the ballot initiative compensated ranchers, and that there would be a limited number of wolves introduced, probably,
and that they would be controlled,
and that it's a controlled area. And the final piece was, look, there is 17 million acres of public land in Colorado, not private land, public land. You own it, the ranchers own it, the citizen sitting in Denver, Colorado, in downtown Denver, a town of, or the metropolitan area is 3 million people. You have just as much right to that public land as does the rancher and those people who live nearby. And that you have just as much right to say that wolves should be on those public lands as anybody else.
as cows.
Yeah, or as cattle. I mean, one of the big issues, the public lands are festooned with cattle, given basically by the federal and state governments to subsidize the cattle industry. But it's a very complex issue, but fundamentally, wolves have the same rights as cattle. So those were some of the key pieces of our message, which was to contrast with the opposition, which said they were dangerous, that they would, consume our herds, that also that they were already here, which was true in a sense. There had been some wolves that had entered Colorado from Wyoming. Never had there been a pack that was permanent and
A viable population.
or a viable population, as my partner puts it. So we had to counter that, and that may have been their strongest argument, which was they're already here. Why should we must spend money, state efforts to bring them if they're already going to count natural recolonization? Well, ultimately, voters decided that natural colonization was not going to happen and that we had to do a reintroduction. We used a variety of tactics, a tremendous amount of online advertising. Why? Because we could target our specific audience. And what was our specific audience? Women between the ages of 30 and 50 years old. They have children who are studying about wolves. They tend to be a lot more engaged with wildlife issues, and they vote. Very difficult to reach men on this particular issue. What we refer to in polling as the gender gap was pretty dramatic. Women supported our initiative probably in the 60% range, 65% range, men probably 40%. So therefore, what we wanted to do is target women. We started out significantly ahead. So our goal was to hold on to what we had. Very simple. And that meant targeting women with online advertising, tremendous amount, some cable television towards the end as we got more money, some other forms of telephone communications done by our colleagues at the Sierra Club. They did a tremendous amount of text messaging. We also made a big effort on editorial boards, newspaper editorial boards. Voters
Letters
look,
to the editors.
yeah, letters to the editors too, but big effort to convince the editorial boards to endorse our effort, our initiative. And that turned out to be very successful because voters turn on initiatives tend to look to so-called experts as well as nonpartisan organizations such as newspapers, League of Women Voters, things such as that. So we spent a good deal of effort, and the major newspaper in the state said yes on wolves. Plus, there was a newspaper in the western slope of Colorado where the wolves were likely to go that was highly supportive of wolf reintroduction. So these are critical pieces of our campaign. There was a fair amount of grassroots outreach through text messaging, but because of the coronavirus, we couldn't have people go door to door, couldn't have people leaflet, and there was very little outdoor sort of activities. The type of people-to-people campaign that we might have run 2 years ago became very, very difficult under the restrictions imposed by the coronavirus. So here are the 4 key lessons that would be appropriate. 1, make sure that every voter or citizen in your impacted area understands the benefit structure of the activity in terms of what was the benefit of wolf reintroduction to voters? Why vote yes? Well, 1 was to restore the balance, 2, to have wolves for future generations, which was also to say, to begin to restore some heritage to Colorado, some of our Colorado heritage, that so our grandchildren could enjoy it. 3, that there would be benefits to wildlife and the ecosystem. These were the key pieces, and that people saw that if there was a benefit to the ecosystem, that was a tangential direct benefit to them. Try to is in writing or in communicating, try to demonstrate that this doesn't really impact seriously the affected areas. That, we made a big effort on the compensation, but also to say, look, there's 17 million acres out there, and there are places in Colorado that there isn't a human being living within 30 miles. So we're not worried about wolf reintroduction impacting even cattle. And one of the things we've also learned is that the deprivation rate in Montana and Wyoming and Idaho, where there are wolves, the deprivation rate of cattle was less than 0.5%. So we use that a lot.
They go after deer, not cattle.
Yeah, I mean, they go after deer. They don't go after cattle. And we have a huge deer population. In fact, we have overbrowsing of deer in many of our stream beds and the like because there's no wolves. 3, diffuse and expand mythology.
Right.
There's everything from the story of Little Red Riding Hood to the big bad wolf to the history of European werewolves. All argues for sort of a mythology about wolves and the meanness and the evil wolf. So we had to go after that in a different way. And one of the ways we did that was to communicate through our videos, science-based activity, that voters look to scientists, but 2, that, we tried to show the wolves in a more, shall we say, less hostile frame. They were always shown, as more, shall we call it, cuddly than they were aggressive. And that was a very important piece to try to demythify the wolf. And you've got to do that. And the final piece, which I think is almost as important, is the notion of you have to understand to some extent that the opposition and the proponents are in a culture war, that it is less about the wolf in this case as it was about urban-rural divides, that this was urban people telling the rural people what to do. It's about, you don't understand our lifestyle. That's why, that's why we don't want wolves, because it'll destroy our lifestyle. We even had one state legislator saying, adding wolves will be the death of ranchers in Colorado. This will be the straw that breaks the camel's back. But, so we had to go against those type of arguments by showing that, it wasn't just the urban voters that would benefit, but that rural voters would too, so that we could break down that cultural antipathy that existed. So altogether, in the end, we won 51-49. We were outspent, particularly the last 4 weeks. We were outspent significantly. The opposition, the group that really funded the opposition was the Elk Foundation, because that's the hunters groups that like to hunt elk. And they're afraid that
There won't be enough.
there won't be enough elk to hunt. Let's be very clear, we have an overpopulation of elk here, but that doesn't stop people from saying, yes, but it will be diminished. It would diminish, even with 100 wolves, it would diminish on an annual basis less than 1% of the elk population. And most of those elk would be ill, sick, or infirm.
The elk that the wolf
Yeah, that.
predate.
Yeah, the wolves predate on, sick old animals that can't run away. So that's pretty much it. So those are the key things, but as always, remember that in thinking about a campaign, it's not about you, it's about them, the voters. It's about the voters and what they think. Or in this case, in terms of your communications, it is about what is the impact on leopards and elephants on the citizens, and what is it that you can do to reduce that impact, work with them in harmony, and begin to mitigate their fears. Those are the key pieces. So let me stop there and take some questions.
Eric, so I'll start with a couple of questions of my own, and after that I'll get to the questions by others. So most of us outside of the US, we are familiar with the wolf reintroduction in Yellowstone. And
Yes.
We know the story about how that led to, or reportedly led to, a trophic cascade and the aspens creek fauna because of herbivores grazing less, and the birds came back and the beavers came back. But we also understand that there was a lot of controversy around that, and there was very famously a New York Times op-ed piece that says that interpretation glosses over a lot of other ecological things that might have worked in parallel along with wolf reintroduction. So with that background, what's your opinion about how Colorado's ecology in the places where wolf was reintroduced would be affected by wolf reintroduction? Do you foresee the same kind of things that happened in Yellowstone if they indeed happened?
I think they did happen. What they didn't do is, and we've been up to Yellowstone with the folks that introduced the wolves, and they're very interesting. They say, yes, there was a trophic cascade, but let's be clear. Yellowstone is a huge area, and you can see the trophic cascade in a couple of places, but it is not, and sort of areas where the wolves, roam, but don't say that it happened everywhere and that it was a tremendous,
It's a
massive
process.
It's a process. So the group that was particularly helpful to us in the campaign, one of the groups was the what we call the angling community, the fishermen, because they very much want wolves, because there's so many elk that it's pushed that they sit by the streams and the rivers and drink water, and they don't move, so that
They erode
the riverbeds, and there's a number of everything from the streams are cloudier so that there's less fish to be able to spawn to. So their argument is this, that with wolves, even if you put in only 100 wolves, you will start to see some rebuilding of streams in areas where there's significant elk. And nobody's promising that there will be sort of a complete revitalization of the ecosystem of Colorado. We might see that in another 300 years, because that's how many years humans have done to totally destroy the ecosystem of Colorado, but 200 years. But I think that there will be some minimal advantages, but it's as much symbolic as it is real.
I think that leads me to my second question, is that you mentioned earlier that there is some tangential benefit to the people in Colorado who have voted for wolf reintroduction. At least you mentioned about the fishermen, but what about the rest of the people in Colorado where the wolf was reintroduced? What is the tangential benefit in the next 10, 20, 30 years for them, which may come as a result of wolf reintroduction? Or is it not that simple?
It's not quite so simple, but I think that what voters voted for was a little bit of symbol and myth.
And a relationship with nature.
And a relationship. And so many people have seen the Yellowstone. I can't tell you the number in focus groups. People say, well, the reason you saw it happen in Yellowstone, and we need to do something like that. Now, you're right. But it's more, when people vote, it's about dreaming very often. It's about dreams. It's about thinking how they would love to have their life or their children's life. And they're imposing on, with their vote, their dreams for a better world. And that's in effect what happened, is that they voted to make a change that they saw in their dreams would be a betterment to the state of Colorado, and ultimately to their, all enjoyment of the wilderness and enjoyment for their grandchildren of the state. When I first moved here 40 years ago, we would do research, and voters all said, people would say, my ultimate dream is to have 40 acres in the Colorado wilderness to build a cabin and be alone. Today, 40 years later, that dream is gone. Their dream is, I want to be able to go to
Hiking in the mountains.
hiking in the mountains for 4 hours or 5 hours and enjoy a wilderness experience
With my grandkids.
with my kids, with my children, with my family. And it's an enjoyment of a wilderness experience as opposed to living in there, because the living in there has gone away.
Great. Okay.
So when you're thinking about, leopards and elephants, it's as much a part of trying to say
Your heritage.
it's your heritage, and you want to leave it for your kids to enjoy and create some generational benefit.
Yes, exactly. All right, moving on to the rest of the questions that were put in the chat box. There was a question from Tiasa, who works with fishing cats here in India. She's asking whether there was an ecological reason why natural recolonization of wolves was not happening in Colorado.
Very good question. And it's important to go back to the Yellowstone situation.
You get shot.
Right. Yellowstone is a national park, so it's federal owned property. When wolves leave Yellowstone, and they are protected within Yellowstone, but you can't tell a wolf
Where there's no fence.
where there's no fence, it's wide open territory. Wolves then can go into the state of Wyoming, and under state law, which they got an exemption from the federal government, they are open to be shot. And it is considered to be, because they are considered to be what's known as a varmint, and threaten the cattle industry and the like. So to get from Yellowstone to Colorado is a 400-mile trek across territory where a wolf can be shot. In addition, one of the major highways in America, Interstate 80, goes through southern Wyoming. So that it's very difficult for the wolves to cross the highway safely. So there have been very few wolves that have come into Colorado, no more than 10, I believe, over the last 20 years.
And it's just usually it's a lone.
It's a lone wolf, generally. We finally saw a pack, we believe, in northwest Colorado, but
6 wolves.
But already 3 of the 6 wolves have been shot when they went back into Wyoming. So it's dangerous, it's unlikely, and most of them have been lone male wolves. As I said, it's, what we've got is, and this is a very American reference, is a male looking for love at a bar, and the bar doesn't have any women. It's just not going to happen. So, and looking for love in all the wrong places, because we don't have very few female wolves that have come into Colorado. I think there's been 1 in the last 20 years.
Okay. So Diya Banerjee had a couple of questions. So one is, what is the general issue of wolf hunting in the US? Are wolves still being hunted? To what extent are they being hunted? Also, I think a related question is that there were moves to remove gray wolf from a protected status last year. So does that remain the same? And is that going to impact the wolf reintroduction?
That's a very good question. Let me see if I can answer the first question. In certain states, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, that there is not a ban on hunting. Now, there's only a certain number of licenses that are given out to hunt wolves, so that theoretically there's a very limited number of wolves that are shot and killed. I believe Wyoming, there may not be I can't remember what the number is, but in Idaho, I believe that the number is something like 150 to 200 a year, and there's over a couple thousand wolves in Idaho. So in specific states, hunting is allowed. It will not be allowed in Colorado until there is at least a viable population. And that would mean at least about 250 wolves before there would be any thought of issuing hunting licenses. Now, do people illegally shoot wolves? Yes. There is a culture that is known as shoot, shovel, and shut up. In other words, shoot them, bury them, and never say a word. So yes, that's possible. Now, the delisting is a very interesting issue. It's being fought rather strongly by the environmental community. It will impact Colorado in that if there is a delisting, actually, in many ways, it makes it easier for us to, it makes us easier for us to introduce, because we don't have to go through various federal regulatory activities. If they are relisted in 2-3 years under the Biden administration, then we would have to go through those hoops. So those are some of the benefits. Short, on a state basis, with the passage of Proposition 114, the delisting helps us. But on a national level, the delisting is very hurtful to the species.
There are a number of questions about introduction of Asian cheetahs or even African cheetahs in India. I'm not sure whether you have an opinion exactly on that reintroduction or whether you have looked at it that closely. But I think the broader question could be that before such a reintroduction, where an animal used to be in a grassland landscape, maybe 200, 300 years back, and you're reintroducing it to the same grassland landscape, what are the typical things that you have to watch out for, apart from conflict with humans, perhaps?
That's actually a very interesting question, because there's a big debate in Colorado about what species of wolf to reintroduce. And we plan to reintroduce the gray wolf. And there are some who argue that the gray wolf that would be reintroduced is from Canada and is a bigger wolf than existed in Colorado 100 years ago. Further, there is elements of the Mexican wolf that may have populated Colorado in the far south at one point. And there are those who argue actually the Mexican wolf should be reintroduced as well. I think what you've got is, when you have a historical, if you can show that history, that they were part of the culture, it's more a cultural piece than it is a biological piece. That the argument has to be made of cultural history, that they belong within the ecosystem, and that in fact that you need to put some blame on humans. You have to be able to say, look, we drove them out. We killed them. And now we need to bring them back both for cultural reasons, but also for restoring the balance and to bring them back to their homeland.
And leave it to the scientists to decide.
And
exactly.
leave it to scientists to decide,
experts.
to the experts where it goes. But it's very important, and I'm not, one of the key words that we used on wolf reintroduction was bring them home. Bring the howl back. Bring it home. To create this notion that it belongs here and that you were bringing it back to a warm and friendly place. We wanted to create the image, going back to minimize the mythology, that this was a part of our heritage, who we are, and that Colorado was the home for wolves. So when you think in terms of the cheetah, it's about bringing them home to where they once were. And yes, we have to bring them from Africa, but they were here in the first place. Before, so it's just a matter of bringing them back to their home.
And letting experts decide
experts decide how to do it and where to do it.
And the exact type.
Yeah, and that's my partner, Joni Braden, who's speaking on.
Yes, that's what, there was another question about your partner and why she can't be seen, but that was asked.
Sorry. Sorry.
All right. So
screen.
There we go.
Okay. So there was a question from Jubilee, I think, who asked, are there any immediate human habitations around the area of this reintroduction? And if yes, did you do any workshops or awareness programs amongst them to promote coexistence and tolerance? Because that's the kind of stuff that we regularly do in India, because they stay right next to the elephants in particular, stay right in the middle of human population in the part of the country that we are in.
So I think that's a very good question. Here's what we are doing. And here's one of the other elements that I didn't mention of the ballot initiative is that prior to reintroduction, there would be a series of public hearings to have a discussion of the proper way of and where to reintroduce wolves. So there's going to be a number of sort of town halls where people can come forward. Two, that there are a number of groups, but particularly defenders of wildlife, a woman by the name of Forthman, who is spending time in ranching country, talking about how to minimize the impact of wolves on ranches. For instance, one of the things that they've learned in California and particularly in Montana is to put flags on your fences. That for whatever reasons, wolves don't like flags. And so move away.
And also to keep the animals moving, keep your cattle moving around. Don't just let them stay in one place for long periods of time.
Yeah.
But there are experts that are working on mitigation of human and a wolf conflict. So.
Yeah. So yes, the simple answer is we're making a big effort to work with the ranching community, and we found, very positive response.
Yeah, there are some ranchers that are very much for reintroduction because they've learned now that it can be a benefit.
What they're finding in some of the ranching communities that is that the wolves are pushing elk back into the higher territories and off of lower land areas that have traditionally been used by cattle and then were taken over by elk. And now they're finding that the elk are moving out back up into the higher areas because of the wolves have been chasing them out. And this is benefiting the cattle ranchers, so that there is that attempt to balance again You know, but remember, change is difficult.
Yeah.
Change is very difficult.
And the ranchers complain that, you know, there's no way that they have so many fences and so much area that there's no way that they'll be able to put red flags on everything. But maybe not, but they can put some, and they can also move there are ways, and I'm not an expert, so I'm not, you know, exactly sure of all of them, but there are ways to reduce the conflict.
One other sort of sidelight note is,
Aside from the fact that wolves don't
well,
go after cattle, they go
yeah,
after
the
elk.
wolves
So.
rarely go after cattle, but the one group that wolves really don't go after are buffalo.
That's a good point.
And what's happening in some of places like Montana
That's a really good point.
is that the ranchers are moving from cattle ranching to buffalo ranching. They're finding it, because the land is much more better for buffalo than cattle. You know, they don't have to worry about bringing them in the winter. They don't have to worry about, you know, much of the native predators on buffalo. If you see a buffalo and you're a wolf, you do not want to tangle with it. And so it is changing, and it's also the result that you can get actually a much better price for buffalo than you can for beef. And increasingly, ranchers are saying, why are we doing this? Why are we doing cattle? Because we've always done cattle, but in fact, probably it would be better to move to buffalo. So as a result, buffalo, there were only 5,000 in America in 1920, are now, I think there's over 1 million buffalo.
Mm-hmm. There is one more question, and that's possibly the last one before I throw it open to others who may want to ask it directly on the webinar. The last one that I'd ask from the chat box is that is hunting the only reason why gray wolves were wiped out in Colorado? And if not, if they were wiped out because of other natural causes, is there any guarantee that they'll thrive in Colorado after the reintroduction, or will there be other threats to their sustainable population?
You know, we do expect that there will be threats from ranchers. That's why we feel that we need to put in initially at least 40 to 50 into, so that it creates a pack. Wolves are very, very adaptable. And where we expect to put them, there won't be a heck of a lot of ranchers and hunters. So the hope is that once we put in 40 to 50, that within 2 or 3 years, that will be somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 to 100, within 5, 100 to 150, so that a singular wolf being shot or will not reduce the pack significantly. There will be other threats. There are mountain lions. There are other, you know, there's civilization. A number of it's legal in Colorado. There are individuals that are known as coyote hunters. And coyotes are considered a varmint. And for instance, a wolf was shot by a coyote hunter a number of years ago, right near where we live.
And they just said they thought it was a coyote.
They thought it was a coyote, and they reported it, and they did everything right. And so no penalties were assessed to them. But there's roads. Another wolf in Colorado was killed across one of the major highways. You know, we do expect that there will be threats both from human and sort of wildlife to some extent, but mostly the threat will be from, call it human development and stupidity.
Okay. All right. So
And,
that's great.
and
So
animal.
I'll throw it open to the audience now. We have 4 more minutes left. We can go a little bit overboard on time if Rick has time, but I think Yash had a question. Diya had more questions, so you can you can unmute yourself and ask those to Rick yourselves.
Yeah, thanks, Orko, and hi to both of you. Yeah, just a quick one, since now there's a colonization of wolves, one in a population in Yellowstone, and now y'all are introducing in Colorado. So my question is, how do you plan to, kind of take care of inbreeding issues, or down the way, maybe in 5-6 years, because we have the same issue with our Asiatic lands in Gujarat. And Ravi Chalam, who is in the webinar today, Ravi is the best expert to talk about that. But we do not have any population exchange, or any corridor in terms of the lands. And so I was wondering, with the major hunting issue around you all, and wolves going out of Yellowstone, getting killed, hunted, and if this population gets so much colonized in some pockets like this, will that not be an issue in terms of the population, inbreeding of the population, or the population health itself?
Okay. One of our plans through the biologists is to introduce wolves, not just from what we plan to do is introduce Wyoming wolves perhaps from northern Michigan, maybe additionally and Canadian wolves. So we will try to bring in 3 different branches of gray wolf into Colorado, so that we do get a genetic mix. In addition, that our plan is to introduce wolves probably once we do 40 to 50 initially, is to bring in 10 to 20 from different locations around the country and around, in order to increase that diversity. But one of the reasons why Colorado is so important is in wolf reintroduction and wolf, the species, is that it does create a bridge between Wyoming to some extent and Mexico and New Mexico, all the way from north to south.
Okay.
And that it is expected that once we're able to do that, that there will be some interaction with the Mexican wolf to create additional genetic infusion. This has been a great desire.
The wolf will be the reintroduction will be monitored over time. If what you say is happening, it will be seen by the experts, and they will do whatever they need to do in order to mitigate that.
Okay.
Because I know what you're talking about, and there is an island population where they're
the Royal Island,
right,
Island Royal,
where the wolves have become inbred, and they're sickly, and it's a big issue. It's a mess. Yeah. So, but that's the thing. If we can do this right and control it, then those kind of things won't happen, because they'll be looked at by the experts that will be able to mitigate it before it occurs.
Thanks so much. All the best with the reintroduction.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
Hello, I had a question. I'm Tiasa. And I mean, I would start off with thanking both of you for explaining the framework of the campaign so patiently. My question, or rather, my interest in knowing, is it would be good to know a little bit more on the interconnectedness among living beings in the heritage of the American West that you alluded to in your talk, especially where does wolf exist in that, myth? And because it is quite a contrast to the big bad wolf myth popular in the West.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh yeah. This is one of the great. So my understanding, and I'm not a wildlife biologist, in fact, and I'm far from it. I'd never even took biology in school.
We do the politics.
We do the politics.
Not the science.
Is that upon arrival of the English settlers, that there were close to 5 million wolves across the United States, that they were, a very common species. They were revered by the native cultures. And we used, in our campaign, we did use Native Americans to talk about the importance of wolves in their culture as a icon in their myths.
And we could send you some of these if you would give us an email. We can send you some of the.
Sure, that would be really interesting to know what their perspective is.
Oh, they were more than they were very helpful in trying to create the sense that they were here before, they were part of our culture, and that they were a part of our myth. They had a very different view of wolves as opposed to Western world. I mean, the Western world is the big bad wolf. Native Americans saw them as
spirit animals,
and providers, and very important elements to the nature and to the balance of nature. So, but Western civilization's understanding of wolves took over, and as they eliminated both Native Americans, they eliminated wolves, because wolves were perceived to be a threat to livestock, to sheep, and a threat to humans, which is really pretty stunning. Because the number of, in the last 100 years, I believe there is one death attributed to wolves
attacking a human.
Attacking a human, or can be attributed to a human death. Yeah. And it's unclear whether or not that wolf was provoked or that was ill. I mean, there's a lot of questions about it. So the threat to humans is pretty de minimis. And it still was a cultural piece of, to be able to clear the West and to clear the lands to make it fit for human habitat, as well as for the ranching community. They exterminated.
Yeah. Thank you so much for explaining this, and I would like to read more about what the Native Americans had to say about the wolf. So I look forward to that.
Yeah,
we can send some videos and things.
That would be great. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks a lot to both of you for introducing us to this topic. Surely there's a lot more to learn, and we'll keep on bugging you with questions, perhaps over emails. I'll distribute that to others who are interested. Thanks a lot for participating in this webinar to others.
Do you have his email?
If you can send me your email, we will send out to you to heal.org. We'll get a variety of videos to send to you. Or
right. So it's basically the same email on which we were having the conversation with you.
Okay.
So, all right. Okay. So great. Thanks all for participating, and thanks to Rick in particular. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. This was great fun, and I hope that it's helpful in all your wildlife restoration and expansion efforts.
Thank you.